We're a little bit ahead of schedule, which is great. Well done. I thought I'd be shouting at people telling you to get off stage at various times. But could I ask the speakers to come back up? We'll just have a little bit of Q&A and a bit of discussion if you can. Okay. Does anybody out there have any questions that they want to ask? Yeah. Is there a mic?
Thank you. Just a quick question for Ulrich. You're talking about this common data environment, like, which pretty much is like in your diagram you show the machine-to-machine communication. You specify like DIN specs, and you're talking about SEN and from a European perspective, from the European standardization body. But there's also the 1M2M, like from ETSI, the other, well, one of the other ESOs, European Standardization Organizations. Does that link in with the ETSI and 1M2M machine-to-machine communication project?
You mean how to automate the exchange between machines in a way that our approach is to define metadata, and by referring to the SEN work group, for example, by defining metadata that is capable to let machines understand what we want to do, in contrast to what the ISO 9650, forgive me, Nick, but the ISO 9650 is, from our perspective, more about how humans are interacting with metadata, and this is not ready to work with machines. Hope this answers your question.
Yeah, and just on that, you also mentioned, or you talked in your slides, it mentioned open CD, but is that open in terms like open source and open standards? Because I mean, ISO, SEN, like ETSI, it's not open standards.
You say it's not open standards. Yeah, I mean.
Well, SEN like are behind paywalls. ISOs are behind paywalls. They're not freely available standards.
So it's hard for me to understand you because of this ambient noise, but I can only guess what your question was. But our approach is, of course, to create an open standard. Not a, we don't want to be a silo, yeah, and that's why we create this open standard. You can look at this at GitHub, for example, and read what this means. You have a definition, a specification in XML. Everybody can read this, import this, create the interface, and is ready to interact with any CDE or Solibri who is implementing this document interface.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Last question, sorry. Yeah? In front. Mike is just coming up to you there now. Okay. I think it's on, yeah.
Thank you, Paul, for your presentation. I had a question related to the files and data incompatible with BIM standards, because the challenge is mostly for the files and data coming from incompatible files. I was wondering if you have any ongoing effort for that area as well.
For file compatibility?
Incompatible with BIM standards. For example, from AutoCAD, the data are not compatible with BIM standards. I was wondering if there is any ongoing research on that area to include them into your workflows.
Well, we mainly focus on Revit and IFC. We are also experimenting with different file formats also at the same time. But our main focus is to try and find a compatibility between all of these file formats. So what we do is we have built our own engine, and what the engine does is when you send over a file, a data source file, IFC or Revit, even if it's coming from any external CDE, the common data environment such as BIM 360 Autodesk Cloud Connect, Procore, wherever it connects. The information, when it comes, we try and create our own proprietary file format from that. So while that's taking place, we parse the data through our engine. When we are parsing the data through our engine, not only do we compare the data that we are creating, we also compare it with the original file. So there is this single source of truth verification that takes place. Once that takes place, then we move on to the step of trying and seeing how best you can use that file in the classification step, where you can use, I previously mentioned, omni-class, uni-class. But for example, also the DE, no, the standard which you were talking about? The DIN spec standard, where you can also use, for example, a standard such as that, which I believe is based upon XML, right? There's an XML version. You can use that. You can create your own set of filters, which could then check for that compatibility, and you could then check it to see, hey, is it compliant against that BIM standard? And what we try to do is everything you create in the platform stays in the platform, but you can also share it amongst users. When you're sharing it, we try and keep it as open as possible. So not only can you download it, but you're building your library of your own information, which is not project dependent. It's rather open and can be easily modified off of the platform or within. I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, sir. Anybody else? Sorry, we have a couple more. Yeah.
Hi, Angus O'Keefe from Rowan and O'Donovan. So, how do you decide what is a CDE and what's not a CDE? So, if we talk about design stage of construction projects and people are sharing information, then yes, that's a CDE. Construction stage, then yes, a CDE. But when you're starting to push asset information from a construction project into a client's information management system, then do you try and fit that into the CDE standard as well? And then how does that relate to, say, the client's asset information management system, which is that something that should be compliant with the DIN spec as well? Like, it's not a black and white. One thing is a CDE and another thing is not a CDE.
I mean, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. It's not that ISO or PAS 1192 invented the term CDE. So we had our product out in 2000. I think Aconex contract and others, Think Project, have been on the market since then. So it's that people who already had a product have been sitting together, creating this DIN spec. Of course, not in contrast with the ISO 9650, but in sync. But the good thing was the ISO is so high level that we have plenty of room to fill this vacuum. So, but it's just describing the status quo. It's not a new invention. We are sitting together, competitors, and say what we are doing already.
I think this is a really important point that I think that also fits very well what Sore mentioned. It's basically like when you move it from one environment to the next one, it might be not perfect anymore, or it might be different aspects, or when you actually have like incomplete information or different formats on it, or you require it in a different format. Like you can't maybe translate all the information from A to B in that way. And all of these capabilities to do this is quite complex actually to share this. And so like I can understand we have all of these different standards, but if we can map them, then the world would be very perfect, very good. But we need these different standards because they have actually a purpose. And I think that's, Angus, what you mentioned around kind of these different environments. They rely on different standards because of a certain purpose. And now we want to transfer that, and we need a capability and an approach to think about. So what do we do if that attribute doesn't fit to this attribute, if there is an inconsistency between another one? And that's a complex task. And whatever we can do on automating this or helping with this helps actually to transfer it from design to construction to maintenance, because I think the value lies in this when we actually use all of that information what we have in the maintenance phase and feeding it back into, so when there's an alteration into the system. I know it's complex, but I think this is the challenge. So, and I think we need to think about this also when we do standards, that we need these different standards and we need to think a way of transforming them into that.
Yeah, no, I also agree.
One more here. Yeah.
Yeah, the world would be boring probably if everybody thinks everything fits together. So we are on this way to define metadata in the SEN group, for example, which is really a hard process because different countries in the EU are doing it differently. For example, the Danish people have a very clear and exact standard about metadata for information containers. Others, like we in Germany, have nothing. So, and others are in between. So, yeah, it's work to do.
But that's also where the whole concept of data standardization, finding a common ground is so important. And having tools that can automate it, but also help you within the work process is really critical, as it not only saves time, but also helps ease the whole workflow.
And that's what when I listen to other presentations today, more and more realize as well. So we need these different standards, but we need to decide how we transform them, how we get that picture from design to maintenance and back. And I think the only way is actually that we work together on this, similar like what the standards community do, what we do in the Innovation Valley Institute, bringing the different people, the different technology providers, architects together and seeing on the different use cases and kind of an agreeing way.
Yeah, and hopefully Verified can play a role in that.
Maybe it's time to hear Nick's question.
Okay.
Which
I think,
might be very...
Yeah. I think I'd just limit myself to some history. A CDE was invented in the year 2000 in the UK on a real project, which was Heathrow Terminal 5. It was developed by Mervyn Richards, and he and I wrote the standard BS 1192 in 2007. Okay, and that is where you will find the first use of the term in a standard. And if you want to understand more about what a CDE is meant to be, you can also look at the UK BIM framework guidance document C. And I think you will find in there some things that disagree with the things that the panelists have said today. So I think we must be careful rushing into making DIN standards or German standards that actually contradict what has already been established.
Absolutely agreed, yeah. And we try to not contradict with this high level. As I said, it's left room for many more precise, not interpretations, but specifications. It's my personal opinion and all of the developers who made this DIN spec. So maybe later we can discuss what the contradictions are and we should remove them, but I'm very curious and keen to learning about this.
Okay. Anybody else? So there's one more there now. Yeah.
This is a really interesting conversation, so it's more of a comment than an actual question. Yeah, Ray Walsh from the Adapt Research Centre in Dublin City University, and I do a lot of work in standardisation as well for both ISO, ETSI, and SEN and various other groups as well. And one of the problems is that standards are not standard. You know, you get different degrees of granularity when it comes to standardization, and ISO standards are not the same as SEN standards or ETSI standards or OPC Foundation or W3C or IETF. Just there's OASIS, there's an open standards. There's a whole load of different variations in standardization and standardization processes. So we need to be cognizant of that, particularly when it comes to data, and because the data that is contained, within these standards, sometimes is used for. It needs to be precise enough to be able to certify or to regulate. If you're looking at legislation, from a European Parliament or European Commission perspective, like they give a standardization request to the European Standards Organization to create standards in particular areas, and they need to be able to certify to those standards. And a lot of standards tend to be more foundational. It could be about frameworks, for example, but they're not very precise technical specifications, which makes it very difficult. They're not like the IEEE standards, for example, which would be very precise, and the more precise the data is, the easier it is to create a certification framework around it. You can get conformity assessment, and then you can do regulations and etc. around that. So it's a really interesting area. And then when you mentioned about data standards, there is some pre-standardization work going on that I'm aware of within a working group within the Big Data Value Association, which is the European Commission's public-private partnership on big data. And that standardization task force is looking at metadata standardization and data standards, particularly in the area of data spaces. So it's a really interesting talk, looking at these different perspectives from right across the board, from the DIN specs to the ISO, from a data governance point of view, and from the industry point of view. And I think that this discussion could just go on and on and on, and thanks for all of those inputs. It's really interesting.
Anybody else? No? Okay. Just one thought I have just on the CDE, and we mentioned in the presentations the single source of truth, which you do have once the data goes into the CDE, and it obviously comes from several different places. And I think people understand the graphical data, they understand the documents as part of the data, but the information that's associated with things, the parameters or the attributes that are associated with things, can come from multiple different sources. So the CDE really needs to try and allow for that as well, and I'm just wondering how you see that working in terms of verification as well, and how you get what is a hugely fragmented industry to come together in some way to manage that process. Some information from the suppliers, some information from the designers, some information from the contractors, some information from facilities management teams, all associated with a single object, and how that's managed and checked through the verification tools and through the CDE as well. What your thoughts are on that?
I mean, I'm not saying this concept of a CDE as an environment is wrong. I mean, this is another approach for looking at this. You're absolutely right. It's not just one single source of truth in the sense that it might come from one single product or database or so. But from the user perspective, it must be clear where the most recent version is. It could be here or there, A, B, C, but it must be clear. Yep. Distributed or not, it must be clear.
Okay. So, Paul, did you?
But that's also where accountability comes in. You need to be sure of, as mentioned, who is transferring what to what, who was the last to check out an item, who was the last to modify it, what steps were taken to modify it, and so forth. So not only accountability, but also checking to sure that whatever is being published is compliant, not only to standards, but project requirements, and in compliance to local standards. So all of that fits in quite well. And yes, as mentioned, the CDE, it's a bracket where all this information is stored, and what we call as being the single source of truth. And when you're publishing a new information, a new version, that's where it goes. And when you're modifying it, that's where you get it from.
Can I maybe just like a forward, I have a little bit of a problem with that word single source of truth. I understand what it's meant to be, this is basically the CDE, and we have the current version of it. So basically, but when I start actually with design, construction, and maintenance, I have already 3 versions of it. So the as is, then the maintenance, then basically, so I update this, and that versioning of the same thing is actually extremely challenging. So the time component in that single source of truth is a really big challenge. And then to maintain this, like if we basically have our representation, to maintain that single source of truth is a huge challenge. So I think that time component, we can't forget that there are different versions of the same thing over time.
Very good.
In fact, I would like to add something, because in different disciplines we are working and we have some extent of progress. For example, in data governance, definitely we have been thinking of that, how we could look after the data somewhere. What I'm saying is that we are trying to take findings from one domain to different domains. What I'm saying is that maybe we need to look at data governance, the principles, how they have been dealing with these different things, and then see if we could borrow something from data governance and bringing this to this challenge for interoperability issues between different CDEs. This is, in science world, this is what we are doing. We are trying to bring some lessons, some best practices from different disciplines. And in my opinion, that's the thing that we are talking now, what we have in data governance domain, which could be applicable to the challenges in BIM area. That's from my side.
I saw a lot of like head shaking. Don't you agree, or is there something else?
Well, it is an interesting Sorry. I'd like to make a suggestion, which is that maybe the construction industry is in the lead on this. For years and years, I've had to listen to people telling me that automotive or aerospace is ahead in IT. Actually, those sectors are looking to the construction sector and saying, wow, you managed to produce these things which are bigger than aeroplanes, more complicated than aeroplanes, and you have teams that are 50 times bigger than we deal with. How do you do it? And things like the CDE are actually an answer to questions that the rest of the industry needs to look at to understand how we're doing it and what's good about what we're saying. And at the heart of it, I'll give you 2 facts. And one is that a CDE is read-only. The only person who can overwrite something that's in the CDE is the original author. And so it's not that the information goes from design to construction to operation. The architect gives his information. Later on, the contractor makes his information. He doesn't change the architect's information. He adds his own. When it comes to operations, each trigger event adds information attributed to the person who's providing that information. So it's not a case of multiple sources of information. Everyone is responsible for their own work. And that's the novelty, and it's a pain. But it's the basis of what the CDE is meant to do. And every time I hear that someone wants to change it and make it multi-user, multi-access, multi-responsibility, multiple blame, I know it's going wrong.
No, I agree. That's also where then you get multiple, versions of the same thing, where everyone is trying to add their own bit to a file, and then you might have overlaps, you might have data that is not meant to be there. So no, I fully agree with your definition of a CDE. That's what it's meant to be, but that's not what it's really coming out to be. But yeah, I guess that's where we need to go towards.
Yeah, well, I'm tempted to say they're looking at us being more complex because we make it so complex. It's the art of reducing complexity by means of standardization, for example. And that does not mean millions of standards, but just a few. And on the European level, for example, we should agree on standards, not have our own standards in our own countries. And this is really a hard work. I'm working at this. You also do this, and it takes time, and it has little progress sometimes. Yeah, to be honest.
Anyone else? Oh, one more. Okay.
Well, it's a very interesting topic.
Just an observation, like, because the changes that happened to the CDE, as Markus said, like, I mean, the temporal nature of the evolution of the CDE as it goes from phase to phase, it very much it's about the control of how it evolves and who's doing the manipulation, like, and when it's done and whether they're authorized to do it, which is like it's a blockchain, you know, the structures required to do that, you know, to have this immutable objects, you know, that people can access and add to, like, but still have the original versions, like, you know, tied up in the chain, like, you know, which means that it's transparent, it's verifiable, you know, and secure.
Thanks, Ray. I think that's a really good analogy suggested around the blockchain type of things, around when we actually can first of all see the progression of it, but also still can revert back on this. And so basically, yeah, so that might be something. So there's still a lot of work in it. And I think what Ulrich said was keeping it simple enough as well, doable. I think that's where we need to really kind of apply the standards in that way, that we manage the complexity in a practical way.
Okay, excellent. Okay, thanks everybody. Just I have a text here from Conor Shaw, who developed that standards picker that I showed you at the beginning, or searcher tool at the beginning. I mentioned it was UCD. I mean, he's based at UCD, but it was actually developed by the European Council for Computing and Construction, EC3, just as a correction in case anybody was asking. Okay, listen, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you very much to the speakers, to Paul, to Ulrich, to Markus, and Zora as well for the input. So thank you very much for that. Time for a coffee break.